In 2019, Notre Dame caught fire. Firefighters had minutes to save the most sacred relic inside. 8 centuries of history were burning. Molten lead dripped from the roof. Smoke filled every corridor. The temperature inside the nave exceeded 800 degrees. The fire burned for 15 hours. The spire collapsed. The roof caved in. But a chaplain and a team of firefighters broke through the smoke to reach a locked vault behind the altar. 2 billion people watched the fire live. Most assumed everything inside was lost. What they carried out was the crown of thorns. The relic, Christianity says, touched Christ. It had been inside Notre Dame for over 700 years. Kings had built entire chapels to house it. The vault was locked with a code only 3 people knew. The chaplain reached it with minutes to spare. The reliquary itself weighed nearly 3 kilograms, solid gold, crystal, gemstones, built to protect a ring of rushes. He entered alone. The ceiling above was already compromised. And when scientists finally tested it, the carbon date did not match what anyone expected. The story begins in 1239. King Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, purchased the crown of thorns from Baldwin II, the last Latin emperor of Constantinople. Louis paid 135,000 livres, more than twice what it cost to build Sainte-Chapelle itself. He built Sainte-Chapelle specifically to house it, a chapel of glass and stone designed as a reliquary the size of a building. Louis built the most expensive church in France to house a single object. The purchase price was staggering, 135,000 livres for a ring of woven rushes. For the next 5 centuries, the crown remained there. Pilgrims came from across Europe to see it. No other relic in Christian history commanded a price like this. The crown was treated as the most valuable object in France. Then, the French Revolution nearly destroyed it. The revolutionaries seized church property across France. The crown moved to the National Library, then to Notre Dame in 1806. That is almost 800 years of documented provenance. Almost no relic has a chain that long. But documented provenance is not the same as scientific authentication. The chain goes back to 1239. Before that, it vanishes for over 1,000 years. By the 4th century, Constantinople had become the relic capital of Christianity. Pilgrims described dozens of passion relics on display. Historians searched Byzantine records for earlier mentions. They found references in pilgrim accounts from the 4th century. The crown was more than a relic. It was a political instrument. Owning it legitimized a king's authority. Egeria, a 4th century pilgrim, described a relic of the true cross displayed in Jerusalem. Others mentioned a crown. The earliest written reference to a crown of thorns in Constantinople dates to roughly the 4th century. That still leaves a 300-year gap between the crucifixion and the first record of the relic existing at all. Skeptics argued the crown was a medieval fabrication, a relic manufactured for the booming trade. The relic trade was enormous. Splinters of the true cross alone could have built an entire forest. Enough saints' bones circulated to fill a cemetery. So when scientists got access to the crown, the first question was simple. How old is it? The crown of thorns is not thorny branches as most imagine. It is a circlet of woven rushes. Botanists identified the material as Juncus balticus, a species of rush that grows wild across the Middle East, including the region around Jerusalem. The thorns themselves are gone. Over the centuries, individual thorns were removed and distributed as separate relics across European churches. The species identification was not contested. The rushes were genuine Middle Eastern material. It grows from Turkey to Israel to Iraq, exactly the region where the Gospels place the events. 70 thorns distributed across Europe, each one enshrined in its own reliquary, each one claimed as authentic. Some 70 individual thorns are claimed to survive in churches from Paris to Pisa. What remained was the woven rush band, and rushes are organic material. Organic material can be carbon dated. Carbon-14 dating measures how long ago a living organism died. For plant material, it works. The science had spoken, but it had spoken in probabilities, not certainties. The expectation was clear. If the rushes dated to the 1st century, the relic gained enormous credibility. Each thorn was a political gift. Kings exchanged them as tokens of alliance and divine favor. If they dated to the medieval period, the relic was almost certainly a fabrication made for the relic trade. The results came back, and they did not match either expectation. The team expected clarity. They got complexity. The result was scientifically perfect, but historically useless on its own. The carbon date pointed to a period that complicated the entire debate. Records show which thorns went where. Henry III of England received 1. The King of Aragon received 3. Carbon dating does not produce a single date. It produces a probability range. And the range depends on where the result falls on the calibration curve. The calibration curve has plateaus where carbon-14 levels barely changed for centuries. The date was centuries older than the fabrication hypothesis allowed. When a sample falls on a plateau, the calendar date becomes ambiguous. A single measurement can correspond to a span of 300 or even 500 years. The crown's date fell on exactly such a plateau, consistent with the 1st century, but also the 3rd and the 4th century, and potentially even later. The test did not prove the crown was real, but it did not prove it was fake either. The medieval fabrication theory predicted a 12th century date. Carbon dating ruled that out entirely. The rushes were ancient, far too old to have been woven in medieval Constantinople or Paris. The medieval relic trade was one of the largest economies in Europe. Fake relics were common. Real ones were priceless. Provenance documents were forged as often as the relics themselves. Authentication was impossible before modern science. 1st century, 3rd century, 4th century, the math gave equal weight to each possibility, but they were not clearly 1st century either. The plateau swallowed the precision, and this is where the story took an unexpected turn, because the carbon date was not the only test. Pollen analysis told a completely different part of the story. Botany offered a different path, not when the rushes died, but where they grew. Avinoam Danan, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, examined pollen found on the crown and the shroud. He identified pollen from Gundelia tourneforti, a thorny plant native to the Middle East that blooms in spring between March and May. The same pollen appeared on both relics. Danan argued both had been in the same geographic region and potentially in physical contact at some point in their history. Danan catalogued 28 pollen species from the crown. 3 were found nowhere outside the Levant. Zygophyllum dumosum, a desert plant found only in the Dead Sea region, and the Negev. The pollen was consistent with the Jerusalem region in spring, the season when, according to the Gospels, the crucifixion took place. Critics pushed back. Pollen is airborne and microscopic. It can contaminate surfaces during centuries of handling. A relic carried across the Mediterranean could pick up pollen from any region it passed through. The crown traveled from Jerusalem to Constantinople, from Constantinople to Venice, from Venice to Paris. Any pollen could have landed on it anywhere along that route. The pollen evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. Right region, but it could not pin the century. And this is where the carbon date and the pollen data together created something neither could alone. The carbon date said the rushes were ancient, between the 1st and 4th centuries. The pollen said the crown had been in the Jerusalem region during spring. The provenance chain placed it in Constantinople since the 4th century and Paris since 1239. Each piece of evidence alone was weak. Together, they formed a pattern that was hard to dismiss. Each pollen grain was identified to species level. The process took months. 28 species, 3 endemic to the Levant, none from France or Italy. The medieval fabrication hypothesis required the rushes to date from the 12th century. Carbon dating eliminated that. It required the pollen to be Mediterranean, but not specifically Levantine. The pollen species were Levantine. No single test was conclusive, but 3 independent analyses all eliminated the simplest explanation. The crown was not made in medieval Europe. That much the science could say. The convergence was imperfect, but it was convergent. 3 independent lines of evidence, all pointing in the same direction, and the comparison to the Shroud of Turin made it more complicated. The Shroud's famous 1988 carbon dating placed it in the medieval period between 1260 and 1390. That result has been contested for decades. Critics say the sample came from a repaired corner. A 2022 study using wide-angle X-ray scattering suggested the Shroud's main body may be significantly older than the corner sample indicated. The same problem haunts every ancient relic. Where you sample determines what you find. For the crown, the sampling question was equally critical. The gold wire was added later. The rushes are original, but centuries of handling, display, and atmospheric exposure could have introduced contaminants that skew the carbon date. Pretreatment protocols remove contaminants, but none are perfect on samples that survived a fire. The 2019 fire introduced another variable. Heat and smoke can alter the isotopic composition of organic materials. Smoke particles had embedded in the rush fibers. Any future carbon test would need to account for this contamination. The crown was placed in a sealed conservation environment within hours of rescue, controlling its exposure from that point forward. The conservation team documented everything, every particle, every fiber, creating a baseline for future analysis. Conservators rushed to assess every relic that survived. The crown was their first priority. The evidence pointed somewhere between the 1st and 4th centuries, but it could not go further. Infrared analysis showed the reliquary had reached temperatures that could alter organic isotope ratios. Every fire, every repair, every hand that touched it changed the chemistry slightly. Post-fire analysis became urgent. The crown had survived, but had the fire compromised future scientific testing? Conservation teams documented every change. The reliquary had protected the crown from direct flame, but smoke and heat had reached it. But here is the twist. The carbon dating controversy around the crown actually reveals a deeper problem with how we authenticate relics. Carbon dating was supposed to be the final word, but it almost never is. The Shroud of Turin's carbon date was supposed to settle the debate in 1988. It did not. 35 years later, researchers are still arguing about whether the sample was representative of the whole cloth. The test worked perfectly. The physics was sound, but the calibration plateau made the answer ambiguous. And the crown is not alone. The Sudarium of Oviedo, the Titulus Crucis, the true cross fragments, every major Passion relic faces the same calibration problem. The Sudarium of Oviedo was carbon dated to the 7th century. Its defenders say contamination shifted the result. Every major relic faces the same dilemma. The test measures the sample. The debate is whether the sample represents the relic. The first few centuries of the Common Era sit on one of the worst plateaus in the entire curve. Any relic claiming to date from Christ's era lands in a radiocarbon dead zone. The technology cannot distinguish between a 1st century relic and a 4th century forgery. Not because the technology failed, but because the atmosphere did not cooperate. Newer techniques may eventually solve this. Bayesian modeling, compound, specific radiocarbon dating, and amino acid analysis can sometimes narrow the range. But for now, the crown of thorns sits in the same scientific limbo as the shroud, too old to be medieval, too ambiguous to be confirmed as 1st century. Compound, specific radiocarbon dating targets individual molecules within a sample. It can bypass surface contaminants entirely. Several research groups have proposed applying this technique to the crown. The Vatican has not yet granted access. And that ambiguity is exactly what makes it one of the most fascinating relics on Earth. The Titulus Crucis in Rome was carbon dated to the 11th century. Defenders argue the wood was replaced, while the inscription is original. The same argument appears for every relic. Test the right part. One answer, test the wrong part. Another, the crown returned to Notre Dame after the restoration. Millions will see it again. For believers, the ambiguity does not matter. Faith does not require a carbon date. The crown sits alongside dozens of untested or partially tested relics, each one waiting for better technology. For scientists, the ambiguity is the point. It means the question remains open. More testing, better techniques, future samples may narrow the range. Every decade brings better instruments. Every technique narrows the range. What the 1980s measured to within 300 years, the 2030s may measure to within 50. And every year, the analytical tools get sharper. What the 1980s could not resolve, the 2030s might. If this was useful, subscribe. We cover the scientific evidence behind every famous relic. The carbon date was not wrong. The carbon date was honest. It said the crown is ancient. It said the medieval theory is dead, but it could not confirm the 1st century. Until the calibration curve cooperates, the question remains. Because the real question was never whether the crown is real. The question is whether science can ever tell us for certain. Inside Notre Dame, an ancient circlet of rushes holds an answer no instrument can yet read.